Thank you, Cahirloch. I welcome the report from the Joint Committee on Transport, Tourism and Sport, which sets out a number of recommendations to improve accessibility to all public transport services for people with disabilities. The recommendations will go some way to improving access. However, I would like to point out that the proposals within the report may not go far enough in terms of improving the situation for people with disabilities living in rural Ireland. The number one barrier people with disabilities face in places like County Donegal is the lack of public transport in the first place. Therefore, measures inherited in this report, while well-intentioned, are not suitably targeted to the realities of living in rural Ireland or a rural constituency if you have a disability. In saying that, I do support the progression of the implementation of this report in the hopes that improvement in rural public transport will be a consideration in the context of all public transport planning, funding and development. Yes, this will require resources, including time and monetary investment, but that is what is required if we are to be a country that prides itself on notions of equality and equity. Let's not forget that in the context of our climate obligations as well, and our necessary transition to a low-carbon economy, we will need to see greater public transport infrastructure across the country, and in particular in rural Ireland. The reality is that people with disabilities living in rural Ireland face an inordinate number of barriers to accessing public transport. Donegal has no rail and no motorway, which makes the bus air and bus fleet a vital part of our transport infrastructure. For a person with a disability coming from Donegal, there are a number of gaps in the planning, funding and development of rural public transport, which lead to significant service interruptions, journeys being cancelled or delayed, or people unable to attempt a journey at all. There have been improvements recently, and I would like to, particularly in the area of upgrading bus stops to make them wheelchair accessible. I have been in touch with the National Transport Authority for years over the rolling out of wheelchair accessible bus stops in Donegal, and it has been successful, and I would like to acknowledge that. But it's not enough. To emphasise this, I want to read from an account from Frank Larkin, a disability activist from Donegal. I believe it's important that the voices of those affected by the issues being debated here today are heard. Take, for example, the journey from Donegal to Dublin, something which for me, as an able-bodied person, is so straightforward. I get in my car and drive uninterrupted for 4 hours to Killybegs, numerous times in 1 week. Or I walk and get on the first bus that comes along and get that bus directly to Dublin and do my business. But for Frank Larkin, as you'll hear in his own words, it is an entirely different scenario. Personally, I wouldn't use bus Éireann ever again. It's been a while, but I had too many bad experiences. The improvements are that the route is now accessible, but all bus options should be accessible, not needing to be booked 24 or 48 hours in advance. It's impossible to make spontaneous trips as things currently stand. Disability awareness and equality training would definitely be required by staff due to the attitude of some people relating to people with disabilities, although they say they do receive this training. To support Frank Larkin's point, the Irish Wheelchair Association recently did a survey which found that 7 out of 10 people with disabilities were dissatisfied with the service offered by Bus Éireann. On Frank Larkin's point of advanced booking required for journeys, I am glad that the report recommends the rolling out of accessibility services and facilities without prior booking. How we achieve this will fall on the government's lap, and whether they are content with increased spending in this area, but I think transport companies really need to get on board this as well. It's clear we need to focus on transport companies themselves and how they deliver their transport services. It looks as though more intense training is required for service providers to help eradicate stigma. The National Disability Authority in a previous report expressed that ease of access also depends on the attitudes of the community as well as those transport staff. And this is something I think we really need to contemplate here today and take on the recommendation that the government develop a public awareness programme as well as a staff training programme for customer care. This training must, where possible, be conducted by people with a disability, and it goes on to say. I am happy with the report's call for minimum standards of accessibility to be set and monitored by a statutory agency with powers to impose sanctions on transport companies that fail to assist people with disabilities. I also welcome the report's recommendation that the National Disability Authority be given powers to monitor and enforce access for people with disabilities. I hope this will be followed through. I acknowledge that the transport companies have disabled people on their boards, and I think that's very welcome, but a lot more needs to be done as well. And it should be noted that greater linked-up thinking is required between the different government departments when it comes to increasing access for people with disabilities. The Department of Social Protection needs to reflect the need for greater accessibility by providing the necessary home supports for all people with disabilities. Some social welfare payments, such as disability benefit, do not cover the free travel pass, and in my view, anyone with a disability, whether temporary or permanent, should be offered a free travel pass until they no longer need it. Let's not forget that barriers to transport create barriers in other parts of life. It can restrict the options for a person attending a third-level institution, for example, and it does restrict a person's access to the job market. As we know too well, it restricts their access to healthcare. It's worth measuring how Ireland stands up to Article 9 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which we recently ratified, and which explicitly states that to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life, state parties shall take appropriate measures to ensure that persons with disabilities access on an equal basis with others to the physical environment, to transportation, to information and communications. And while we have made progress, we still have a very long way to go, and I hope we keep going in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Thomas.